Good morning, lit peeps. So this is Dr. Graves, and this will be your sole video lecture on Shardik for this week. You should be checking in at the class check-in Monday and today and listening to the excerpts from Shardik, the assigned chapters. I will track class attendance that way by looking at who's listening to the audio recordings of the chapters from Shardik. So you should already have filled in some notes while listening to those chapters about the characters here on your class notes 12A. I'm going to give you a little bit information and highlight what I consider important about these characters that you should have noted. So first of all, in the upper right-hand corner is Genshad. Genshad is an illegal slave trader. His specialty is children. You should have notes. You should have listened carefully, and you should understand, why Genshad is illegal. I mean, for example, who instituted the slave trade in Bekla? Who okayed that? Now, it is a regulated slave trade that was approved and installed as a government policy. But Genshad is not a licensed slave trader. He is an illegal slave trader, and you should listen carefully to why was he denied a license? Why is he illegal? So Genshad represents the Genshad is parallel to Shardik. Actually, Shardik is the power of God, and in Genshad we see another power embodied. Radu at one point says he's a devil. At some point, he served hell for so long that the devil is inhabiting his body, and it is the devil we're interacting with, no longer the person of Genshad. So that's pretty strong language, and Genshad is in these final chapters. He is the most powerful of them all in the face of this dying bear. Okay, so we have Genshad. Beneath Genshad are his two overseers here. Okay, the shorter, squattier one is Bled, B-L-E-D. The taller boy next to him figure is Shouter. So Bled and Shouter are Genshad's overseers. In other words, Genshad has these children that he is taking. His specialty, by the way, are what kind of children? And the other question I have for you, and you should note the answers to these questions on class notes 12A. I will be looking at your class notes when I grade them to see if you've answered these questions about Genshad. What kind of children does Genshad specialize in? What market? So it's a niche market, just like we'll meet Lalak in a moment, and Lalak also is a slave trader in children. Let's just right quick go down. He is this heavy-set figure, in the bottom lower right quadrant, this Lalak. He is also a slave trader in children. He is different from Genshad in that he is a legal slave trader. Keldric recognizes him, even though he does not recognize Keldric, because Keldric himself, as king of Bekla, is the one that gave Lalak his license. And we learn a lot about Lalak from Keldric because Keldric knows a lot about him. So both of these men, one is legal, one's illegal. Genshad illegal, Lalak legal. And both of these men specialize in this children's slave trade. So children are the market. They're selling to people who want slave children. There's a difference in the purposes for which their customers want these children. Why do Genshad's customers buy children from him, and to what use do they put these slave children? Why do Lalak's customers buy children from him? And geez, to what use do they put these children? And so there's some differences there. One's legal, one's illegal, the way they handle their children. Do they both harm their children? Do they use the threat of personal injury as a way to control their children? And listen carefully to the conversation between Lalak and Genshed, where Lalak explains to Genshed where he goes wrong in becoming a successful slave trader. And then, so Shouter, and then the second question, excuse me, I want you to answer that I'm looking for in your class notes is, how does Genshed acquire his children? How does Lalak acquire their children, these slave traders? I mean, obviously, it's a regulated trade. They cannot kidnap them. They cannot steal children. Where do these slave children come from? And that's a very important question. And as you look at the character of Shouter, so Bled he's crazy, he's insane, and he's already killed 3 of the slave children in his position as overseer. By the time we meet him in the book, and Genshed is looking for another overseer because Bled's just too violent and too crazy. Look at Shouter. So how did Genshed acquire Shouter? The character arc of Shouter is going to be a very important secondary character arc, secondary subplot to watch in these last few chapters of the book. Richard Adams is going to say something very important through the development of the character of Shardik. So be alert and be aware and be listening for that. Over on the left side, we have Radu and we have Shara right here. Radu and Shara, okay? And Radu and Shara are slave children. Shara, at this point in the story, is the only girl left in the group of slave children owned by Genshed. Radu is the only slave child that Genshed has acquired illegally by kidnapping. Radu is the son of Elaroth. I think I introduced Elaroth earlier in last week's lecture. Elaroth is the Ban of Sarkid, and he's one of the generals leading the rebellion of the southern peoples, the Yaudashe, against the Beklan Empire, now as it is ruled by the Ortelgans, by Keldric, under the name of Krendric. Krendric and Keldric are the same person. Krendric is the name that Keldric assumed as priest king of the Beklan Empire. It means eye of God, Krendric. So it was Keldric who legalized the slave trade, who instituted it. He needed it. He's a good administrator. He's a good, so he has administrative gifts. And in securing the economic welfare of Bekla after the war with the Ortelgans, he institutes the slave trade. He controls it tightly, supposedly. That's his idea. That's how he justifies this action in his mind. And it's for a limited time. It's supposedly for a limited time, just to generate the money he needs to support his troops on the battlefield. He talks about this. He's thinking about it in his mind when Lalak comes on the scene in chapter 52. So, Radu, Genshed kidnaps Radu for ransom money from Elaroth. He recognizes and knows who he is. Listen carefully. What are the circumstances in which, what's Radu doing? What's he doing? How does he put himself into Genshed's circle of influence? Into Genshed's sphere of power? And Shara, why is Radu so ardently concerned about Shara? so that Radu goes without food. He gives his food to Shara. Radu goes without things in order to protect Shara and keep her alive. Shara is a little girl, I don't know, about 5 years old, and she is the daughter of one of the tenant farmers on one of Elaroth's estates in the southern part of Bakla, in the area called Yeldashe, Sarkid. So Shara is from a tenant family, in other words, a servant family, a family that is under Elaroth's care and serves his estate. Okay, Radu, the son of Elaroth, kidnapped by Genshed, Shara, the daughter of one of Radu's father's servants. And then we come down to the bottom of the page where I mentioned before, yeah, I'm trying to keep this in the camera, Lalak, and we talked about him. And then finally in this fall corner, Siristru, you're not going to meet Siristru until next week. He appears in our final chapter, chapter 58 and 58 only. For now, all you need to know is that he is an ambassador. He's an envoy being sent by a distant king in an empire previously unknown to the Baklans called Zakalan. So we will meet him. He comes to Bekla at the end of the story, 5 years after the current action, the climax of the story in chapter 54. Okay, so let's look at some of the deeper issues going on in this story that you should be listening for. I mentioned, I think, the word power and will, and that these are important words, worship and service, and the prophetic, the exercise of the prophetic, as we see in Kalderic. So first of all, let's just talk because Adams is getting his points across through the lives of his characters. So today we're going to look at 4 characters, and we're going to look at what's happened to these characters and what is happening to them in the story, in the novel Shardik. The first character I want to look at is Melithus. And Melithus, as we meet her in chapter 44, 43, 44, 45, is redeemed. So Melithus is the first redeemed character. If this book is a book on the problem of evil, and Adam's central concern is to define evil, to locate the source of evil, to portray how people become more or less evil. And finally, Adams is very concerned with how evil is not only resisted, but overcome. Then each of his characters is going to go through their story arc is one of redemption. And Adams is defining redemption as what? The overcoming of evil. And in fact, he uses a very biblical concept here. So remember that Shardik is not an allegory. But as we prepare for Easter this week, you should listen to the story, read it through chapter 54. The climax of the story is in chapter 54. It is with the bear's death. So it's very appropriate. It's excellent timing that this is happening the week that we celebrate the death and the resurrection of the man, Jesus Christ, the man God, Jesus of Nazareth. So I want you to think about these things, because this is exactly what's on Richard Adams' heart and mind, what's motivating him as he writes, as he conceived and wrote the novel Shardik. So Melithus is redeemed. Redemption is being defined as the overcoming of evil with good. So it's not overcoming evil with evil. You remember a key statement in the very beginning of those excerpts we looked at. Keldrick asked the Tuginda, why did you let the Baron go when he tried to kill Shardik? And she said, her response to him was, oh, well, what do I do? Overcome evil with evil? Is that how evil is overcome? To exercise greater evil. So if someone murders, murder them. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. That may be the definition of justice. But is that definition of victory over evil? So often I think of this in terms of Hitler. So Hitler's dead, he was killed, he was buried in his bunker. Does that mean that the spirit that motivated, that inhabited Hitler is dead? Or is that spirit still, does it still exist? The spirit that inhabited the Nazi movement, that motivated them. Is it still there? Does it still exist? Can spirits be killed? How does one overcome an evil spirit? Well, Jesus did say, overcome evil with good. And only when, where evil existed, good comes into existence. Is evil well and truly overcome? So let's think about this. This is the heart of Adam's theme here. So redemption is the overcoming of evil with good. So in Malithus, we see this priestess that betrayed her God and her authority, the Tuginda, representative of that God, in order to save her life. And her story you're well familiar with at this point, so I won't go back over it. But from Malithus, then, if we're going to say that redemption is the overcoming of evil with good, then we have to define evil. We have to define evil. And when we define evil, we are by default defining good. So for Malithus, evil is separation. It's betrayal. So again, we're back there with Dante. This Christian worldview seems to see evil in terms of either faithfulness or betrayal, breaking the faith. Okay? And this faithfulness is being depicted in Shardik not as faithfulness to a religious system and certain statements of belief, but to a being, to God himself. So Malithus understands her betrayal in terms of betraying the Tuginda, whom she loves, who has been a mother figure in her life. But if we look back, it's on page 399 in the book. In chapter 43, the end of chapter 43 from last week, this is what Malithus is telling Keldrick that evening after he and the Tuginda have found her there at praying over Belcatraz at the Baron's grave. Malithus wept quietly and continuously as she went on. I had put out of my mind how I came to Zoray and the reason why. My treachery, my cowardice, my sacrilege. My treachery, my cowardice, my sacrilege. She broke trust. She betrayed. She was a traitor to Shardik, to the Tuginda. Perhaps I thought that my sufferings had blotted them out, had dug a ditch between me and that priestess who broke her vows, betrayed Lord Shardik, and failed the Tuginda. So her story is a story of cowardice. When push comes to shove, she's afraid and she runs for her life. It's a story of betrayal. It's a story of sacrilege, of turning against her faith, of living as if it's not true, as if it's not reality, it's not truth, it's not real. And that's her story at this point. Tonight, when I turned and saw who was standing behind me, do you know what I thought? I thought, she has come to Zeray to find me, either to renounce me or forgive me, either to condemn me or take me back to Quiso, as though I were not defiled 40 times over. I fell at her feet to implore her forgiveness, to tell her I was not worth what I believed she had done. So at that moment, Melithus's whole focus is on the Tuginda. When she sees the Tuginda, she thinks the Tuginda has been looking for her. Only then she realizes. And now I know it's true what she said. God, and letting her head fall forward on her arms across the table, Melithus sobbed bitterly. God can afford to wait. God can afford to wait. This is the moment of Melithus's redemption. This is her great revelation. This is where she is, as she tells Keldrick later, is restored to faith and to faith in life. And the great revelation here is that it wasn't the Tuginda at all that was looking for her, was it? No, the Tuginda wasn't in Zeray. Melithus wasn't even in her mind. She'd long forgotten her. Melithus's choices were on Melithus's head. The Tuginda's duty, her acts of obedience were to follow Shardik, as was Keldrick's. That's how the two of them reunited, as each was pursuing the bear. And it brought them to their paths crossed in that pursuit again. And here, their pursuit of the bear led them where? It was the bear who led them to Melithus. God knew where she was all the time. He could afford to wait. What was he waiting on? Waiting on for the fullness of time, the fullness of the consequences of Melithus's actions to catch up with her and bring her to the point where she recognized his ultimate control of everything, his presence. I don't want to use the word control here, because control is a word that we're going to associate with the power of Genshed, the power of evil. Oh no, it's that time is in God's control. It's not that God controls our hearts or our choices or our actions, or even that he has a wish to control us. No, it's time that's under God's control, and he can afford to wait. He can let time do its work. And what is the work of time? The work of time is to bring to full fruit the consequences of all our choices and all our actions, the full consequences of actions of obedience and actions of disobedience. And it is in the ripening of these consequences, it is in the passage of time, and time that only exists in this material universe, this place where things can hide beneath the surfaces of creation, of a person's face. It is only in this place of time that consequences happen, and that consequences are inevitable. The one thing that you can stake your life on is that your actions will have consequences. Your choices will have consequences. And you may not reap the fullness of those consequences. You may not even see the true nature of those consequences immediately, or in a year, or 2 years, or 5 years' time. At this point in our story, it's been 5 years since the Ortelgans conquered Bekla. Keldric ruled as priest king 5 years in Bekla. So this is 5 years later, 5 years, when the Tuginda and Keldric stumble upon Malithus praying over Belcatraz's grave in Zeray, led there by the bear. So this is extremely important to understanding what's going to happen in these last chapters and what Richard Adams is about in these chapters. What is the definition of evil? If redemption is overcoming the power of evil, then how is evil being redeemed? Then what is the definition of evil? And for Malithus, it's clear. Adams is very clear here. Just as he was at pains to show us what oneness with God looks like at the beginning of this story, with Keldric's oneness with God, where he actually enters into he's so one with the bear that he's seeing through the bear's eyes. He's feeling through the bear's body pain. He's seeing through he's inhabiting, if you will, the bear. So that we have this mystical union of God and man that happens within the context of Keldric's relationship with the bear. And for Malithus, then, the opposite of this is when she forsakes this oneness and she separates herself. In trying to save her life, she separates herself from the Tuginda and from Shardik. And this separation, Malithus understands as betrayal. And this is the evil. I mean, all of the evil things that happen to her afterwards are not, they're the fruit of evil. they're the natural consequences of evil, but the evil itself is the separation that has occurred between her and Shardik. That's what, then all of these other things just become consequences of the loss of her oneness with the bear. And it's death. She's surviving. And let me go back and just call your attention again. I know I read these passages to you before. They must be pretty important to the theme of Shardik if Dr. Graves is going back to them this week. So she tells, when Keldric tells his story and how he feels like since Shardik is doomed to death because he went down into the streels of Urta and came back out, and that's a sign that he's doomed to die. There's no other choice. That's the will of God, but that it will be a sacred death. Then, and Keldric, because of his oneness with Shardik, feels like, well, then that's me. That means I have to die too. And this is what the redeemed Malithus says to Keldric. I told you, wait upon the outcome, consequences, the fullness of the consequences. Keldric, you must have faith. I have been restored to faith in life. If only they would understand it, if only they would understand it. The task of the disgraced and guilty is not to struggle to redeem themselves, but simply to wait, never to cease to wait, in the hope and expectation of redemption. Many err in setting that hope aside, in losing belief that they are still sons and daughters. So what Malithus is saying here, now notice how she's equating this separation that she has experienced from Shardik and Malithus and the Tuginda, but from Shardik and therefore from God. She's equating this separation. That's evil, living apart from this oneness. That's evil. Living for oneself, that's evil. She's saying that's evil. To live one's life for oneself, for one's own benefit, that's evil. And she's equating that with death. And she's saying, I was dead. I was dying. I was dying in my sins. And I had this respite when Belcatrazit appeared. But he died, and I knew what was ahead. I knew what the consequences, what the outcomes of that are. And survival. All I had been doing since I left Shardik, I left the search for Shardik, I left his service. All I've been doing is surviving, just trying to keep body together, to keep my body alive. But really, that was death. I wasn't alive at all. I had lost life in that separation. And she's saying survival is not life. And now that she's been redeemed, this is bigger than forgiveness. Understand that she saw the Tuginda, and she was thinking the Tuginda was either going to renounce her or forgive her. And she was seeking that forgiveness. But the forgiveness is just a small thing compared to that opportunity. What's really being offered to her is the opportunity to be restored to oneness. She was being given a second chance to be one with her God after leaving him. And at this point, Melithus, living through the consequences of her actions in this fullness of time idea, and to wait until there's this fullness of the consequences of her actions, her disobedience, actions of disobedience. She finds that, now remember, Adams is speaking to believers here. All of these characters are believers in the bear, all the Ortelgan characters. So here's Melithus, and there's also consequences of belief, of knowing that God is real. And she never denied, like Holga, denied God's reality. She just was living in this utter failure, this separation from him. But bigger than forgiveness in the terms of the novel of Shardik, bigger than forgiveness is restoration to oneness. Because forgiveness is just the first step towards being connected again with the vine and feeling the life-giving sap of that vine once again flowing through one's own body, one's limbs, one's soul, one's heart, one's spirit. So it's life. And notice how we're right back to where the pagan definition of evil was that we started with the Greeks in Sophocles, where evil was ultimately defined as fate, and the fate is death. And death is the enemy. Death is evil. And there was no hope, right, for new life. For the Greeks, for those outside of the Christian worldview, but it's with this wonderful coming of Jesus Christ into our midst, into this material universe of time and space, right? That we're celebrating this week, that we're celebrating this weekend. Marvelous, marvelous thing. Wonderful news. And we're celebrating that this weekend. And this is what Adams is showing here, that yes. So, and this is what Melithus understands. And she says, I can't put it into words. Dr. Graves can't put it into words either for you. I wish I could. But it's something that has to be experienced, said Melithus. It has to be caught, can't be taught. But she said, I understand so much more than I can put into words, Keldrick. And this is what I understand, that life comes from oneness with God. And I have been restored to that oneness. God hadn't forgotten me. All the consequences of my evil choices, my disobedience. God has waited to this point, and he never forgot me. And he came when I needed him most. She was praying for him in the most desperate of situations. And there he was, and restored her to hope and to life. So are you following me? Track with me, please, students. So if Adams is defining redemption as the overcoming of the power of evil with the power of good, and he's defining evil as separation from God, and that God is life, and life is only found in oneness with him in the vine, then evil is death. The wages of sin are death. And then he's going on and saying, and there has been a way made to be restored to that oneness. And that is waiting on God, because you're not going to be able to restore yourself to that oneness. It has to be God, but he knows what he's doing. He is the master of time, and he will, in the fullness of time, when you need him most, he will be there. So now we understand the completion of Malithus's redemption, because she will follow Shardik, even if it means her own death. Okay? He is her life at this point on to the end of the book. And that's why in chapter 48, we find Keldrick so mad and angry, going after the bear, having to go against his will. It's not his choice, and it's not his obedience. It's because Malithus has told him, if he doesn't, she is. When they hear that Shardik is there in the area, in Lac, Malithus says, I'm going, because I've learned it's only oneness with the bear where life can be found. And I am never betraying him again. I will follow him to the end, to the bitterest of ends, to the most violent of ends. It doesn't matter what the end is. What matters is life, and life is only in the bear. So Keldrick's like, I can't let you go, Malithus. All right, darn it, gosh. I'm not going to let you do that. I'm not going to let you put your life in the end. My love for you is the only thing that is left me in this world. That's the only place I'm finding any life right now, is in my relationship with you, Malithus. So gosh darn, I'll go find the bear. And at the end of chapter 48, we find him cursing Shardik. He's so filled with anger, and he is blaming the bear for the consequences of his choices and his actions, even while he recognizes them as his own choices and actions and as betrayal. He hasn't taken responsibility for them. He hasn't submitted to those consequences. He's resisting, he's rebelling against the consequences of his own choices and his own actions at the end of chapter 48. And let's move here then to Keldrick's Keldrick's character arc, and just touch on these quickly. So at the end of chapter 48, notice this is Keldrick's attitude. Curse you, he cried silently in his heart. Curse you, Shardik. Curse your supposed power. Why don't you save us from Zeray? We who've lost all we possessed for your sake. We whom you've ruined and deceived. Look where he's putting the blame at. You've ruined us. You've deceived us. We thought you had power. No, you can't save us. You can't even save the women who have served you all their lives. He's thinking about the Tiginda back in Zere, who's ill to the point of dying. Why don't you just die and get out of the way? Die, Shardik, die, die, die. And that's where he's at. But notice once he falls into the hands of the slave trader, just one chapter later, there's been a shift. And this shift in his thinking, the shift in his understanding, the shift in beginning to take responsibility for the consequences of his actions instead of blaming God for those consequences. Look what happens here. It was Shardik who had brought him to this, Shardik who had pursued him with supernatural malevolence. So he's still attributing this falling into the slave trader's hands to Shardik. And he's probably right, huh? Just like Malathus recognizing that ending up in Zerai, God knew that would be the consequences of her actions. And he let her do it, avenging all that his priest king had done to abuse or exploit him. He was justly, notice there's been a shift here. So after this, Keldrick's like, this is God's justice. Remember Dante? Remember the definition of justice we looked at going through the inferno, the damned? I mean, at the end of 48, Keldrick sounds like one of the damned in Dante's Inferno. He's blaming God rather than taking any kind of responsibility for his actions. But here he says he's justly accused of Shardik, and in his punishment had involved not only Malathus, but the Tuginda herself. She, he's talking about the Tuginda now, she who had done all she could in the face of every obstacle put in her way to preserve the worship of Shardik from betrayal. So there's been a shift here, and Keldrick's beginning to see his own role in this more clearly, more objectively, more honestly, that he's been blaming God and asking God to save him from himself. So let's go ahead now. So Keldrick's redemption arc that we're going to see at this point from chapter 49 through chapter 57 is the restoration of his oneness with Shardik. So I want you to look at how that happens, how the consequences of his, so he hasn't tasted the fullness of the cup. He hasn't drunk his cup to the bottom, if I can put it that way. He's not come to the dregs at the bottom of the cup of the consequences of his actions and choices. But he's beginning to see that that is exactly what this is God hasn't created this. It's not God hurting him or harming him or putting him under the power of evil. It is he himself in his choices that have done this. And then the third character I want to talk briefly about as I wind this up is Genshed. Genshed we meet in chapter 49, and Genshed represents the power of evil. And if you look in chapter 50, where Radu is talking about Genshed, Radu is Elarath's son, Elarath, who is Keldrick's sworn enemy. And Radu talks about, this is how Radu describes Genshed, page 474 in the book, where he's concerned. Okay, so Radu says, Keldrick's response is, he's nothing but a contemptible brute, a sneak thief, mean and stupid. That's when Keldrick first finds himself in Genshed's power. He was once, answered Radu, but that was before he got the power. Before he got the power. What do you mean, says Keldrick? What power? Now listen carefully. This is Adam's description, definition, if you will, of the power of evil. Where he's concerned, it's no longer a matter of thieves and honest men, said Radu. He's gone beyond that. Once he was nothing but a cruel, nasty slum creeper. But evil has made him strong. He's paid its price, and in return, he's being given its power.